Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, the show where nothing explodes, nobody wins a war, and absolutely no one raises their voice. Tonight, we'll drift into the quieter corners of the past, where bridge keepers took notes in the rain. Monks argued about candle sizes, and entire empires rose very slowly. So, settle in. Let the world fade. You don't need to remember any names or dates. You're just here, listening, floating gently through time. We begin now. In the soft golden glow of early Mesopotamian dawn, when the waters of the Euphrates shimmered like warm bronze, you might find yourself standing beside a man crouched over a flat stone. He's not a farmer, not a priest, not a scribe, but a timekeeper. And unlike the drama-filled stories of war or gods, this man's concern is far simpler: when to open the temple gate. All he needs to know is where the shadow falls. The Babylonians, living as early as 2000 BCE, didn't think of time in hours and minutes, but in practical segments of light and darkness. And yet, they were some of the first people on Earth to try to pin the sun down with science. This is the story of how they did it. The land of Babylonia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, was not one of leisure. Its people were planners, astronomers, agronomists, architects of ziggurats and ziggurats of knowledge. But perhaps most remarkably, they were inventors of routine. Their cities, such as Ur and Babylon, buzzed with activity that depended on regularity. Irrigation systems needed precise timing. Religious rituals occurred at set moments of the day, and scribes had to begin their recordings at the right sliver of sunlight. Enter the sundial, or at least its earliest ancestor, the gnomon. A gnomon is nothing more than a stick, or pillar, or rod stuck upright into the earth. As the sun travels across the sky, it casts a moving shadow, tracing a slow arc from west to east. For the Babylonians, who noticed patterns in everything from the stars to sheep intestines, the consistency of this moving shadow presented an irresistible puzzle. They began marking where the shadow fell at different times of the year. At first, it was just part of ritual observations: sunrise at solstice, sunset at equinox. But over generations, it became more methodical. You can imagine a priest-scientist at dawn, laying pebbles in a curve that mirrored the shadow's stretch. By midday, the shadow would shrink to a stub. In the evening, it would lengthen again, in reverse. Over time, these observations became standardized. The priests developed a kind of calendar built not just from days and months, but from the shape of a shadow. The Babylonians divided the day and night into 12 parts each before anyone ever wore a watch. These hours weren't fixed like ours. They changed with the seasons, longer in summer, shorter in winter. And this made the sundial a living instrument, always adjusting to the world around it. And to keep this system alive, Someone had to maintain the gnomons. In larger temples and city squares, these gnomons were carved from stone, etched with tiny grooves or hash marks. They stood proudly, casting time like slow-moving sundials across the dusty courtyards. Their upkeep was assigned to a particular class of temple assistants, scribes in training, apprentices, or even elderly officials who could no longer make long journeys but still served by watching shadows drift. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady, predictable, and in the ancient world, that was valuable. At night, these same priests would climb onto the ziggurats and watch the stars, tracing patterns of planets and constellations. By morning, they'd turn back to their gnomons, comparing the shadows to the sky they'd studied only hours earlier. Slowly, this observation routine began to morph into a kind of proto-science. They began recording their findings on clay tablets, over 6,000 of which survive to this day. Some of these tablets are nothing more than lists. On the 15th day of Tammuz, the shadow reached the third groove by midday. But others hint at deeper calculations. The Babylonians already invented a base 60 number system, and they used it to slice time into manageable pieces. But for the everyday Babylonian, time still flowed in broader strokes. There was the time for planting barley, the time for temple cleansing, the time for afternoon rest when the sun struck the courtyard like a hammer and even the shadows seemed too tired to stretch. The gnomon's greatest gift, perhaps, wasn't precision, it was rhythm. A slow rhythm that matched the steady work of Mesopotamian life. One didn't need to know what time it was exactly. Just when the shadow reached the second groove, it was time to feed the goats. When it shrank to the center line, it was time to open the temple gate. Even punishment was administered by shadow. A common form of discipline in Babylonian schools involved standing a child beside the gnomon until the shadow crept across a certain number of lines. A slow and boring ordeal intended to make them reflect on their misdeeds. And of course, with every system came superstition. A shadow that split in two at midday was seen as an omen. A gnomon that cast no shadow might be interpreted as divine displeasure or impending storm. In a land where God seemed to speak through everything, even shadows were full of meaning. You might imagine a young apprentice scribbling notes beside a stone gnomon, wondering whether he was recording science or prophecy, whether the sun cared at all about the marks he was making. But still, he scribbled. So what happens when the sky is cloudy, when the shadows vanish and the gnomon is blind? That question, more than any philosophical debate, pushed Babylonian timekeepers toward backup methods. Water clocks, clepsydras soon joined the priestly toolkit. But those had their own complications. They needed to be refilled. They froze in winter. They weren't always accurate. No, the shadow remained king. It was free. It was natural. It answered only to the sun. Yet even as Babylonian cities grew and empires shifted, the gnomon quietly remained, a modest stone in a temple courtyard, ignored by most, yet trusted more than any king or tablet. But how exactly did it calibrate these gnomons? How did they manage discrepancies between temples? And who got to decide that one groove marked third hour, while another marked the fifth?
You're still standing in the temple courtyard. Morning sun rising slowly over the walls of Babylon. The gnomon, just a stone pillar, unremarkable to most, casts its narrow shadow across the grooved platform. If you knew how to read it, it would tell you what the priests had known for centuries, not just the time of day, but the season, the approaching equinox, and whether the barley should go in the ground soon. But there's a problem. What if the same time of day looked different depending on where you were in the city or across the kingdom? The shadow doesn't lie, but it changes. A gnomon on a hill casts a different stretch than one in a sunken plaza. Different cities, different latitudes, even different altitudes, each twist the sun's whisper in slightly different ways. So how did Babylonian timekeepers bring any sense of order to such a slippery thing? They did what all administrators eventually do. They made tables. Babylonian scholars, usually priest-scribes trained in the temples, began to codify shadow lengths across the year, not in vague observations, but in hard numbers. They called them shadow lengths for the day, and these numbers were inscribed onto clay tablets alongside the name of the month, the temple location, and sometimes the height of the gnomon itself. It turns out that if you make your gnomon the same height everywhere, the ratios stay remarkably consistent. So they standardized many of them, sometimes to a cubit, though roughly 50 centimeters, though variations did exist. A gnomon 1 cubit tall might cast a shadow of 3 cubits long at sunrise, but only half a cubit by noon. These changing proportions, often presented in a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 format, became the language of Mesopotamian timekeeping. Even more remarkably, the Babylonians developed shadow-length ratios tied to their own astronomical calendar. They didn't think of time in hours like we do, but in watches and portions of daylight. 12 segments of light, 12 of darkness. On the equinoxes, each portion was about the same. But on the solstices, the ratios skewed, and Babylonian tables accounted for that. You can picture it, a room deep in the ziggurat, shelves lined with hardened clay tablets. Each tablet contains numbers, some intuitive, others cryptic, but together they represent a working timekeeping system that spans miles and generations. It is, in every sense, one of the earliest known bureaucracies of time. This is where the story grows quieter, but also deeper. The man responsible for managing these tables was not necessarily a priest or scholar of great renown. Often it was someone trusted for their attention to dull detail. His job was to reconcile the shadow data from various temples. If the courtyard in Nippur reported that the third groove was reached by the 7th shadow length, and the scribe in Uruk claimed it occurred at the 6th, something had to be done. So the timekeeper reconciled. He averaged. Sometimes he adjusted the grooves in the stone. Sometimes he changed the position of the gnomon slightly, less than a finger's width. Sometimes he simply noted the discrepancy, shrugged, and added a line of cuneiform to explain it. The rains came early. A bird perched on the gnomon at sunrise. These notes still survive. But this wasn't merely an intellectual exercise. Temple schedules depended on this system. Rituals of immense importance, offerings, readings, blessings, all had to occur when the sun's arm points straight. In fact, timekeeping became so central that some temples hired multiple scribes just to maintain the gnomon shadow records. And yet, what's perhaps most interesting is what the Babylonians didn't do. They never tried to separate time from the natural world. Even with these ratios, even with these records, there was no sense of abstract time. There were no clocks as objects that ticked in isolation. Every moment was still tied to the sun, the stars, the seasons, and the environment. Their system wasn't meant to rule time. It was meant to interpret it. Occasionally, the sun would behave strangely. A cloudy week, an eclipse, a heat haze that bent the light. When that happened, the gnomon might seem confused. A shadow might fall too short, too fast, or vanish altogether. The timekeeper didn't panic. He referred to the star tables, the water clock, the position of Jupiter. Everything had a backup. And in this web of approximations and calibrations, an idea slowly took shape. That time itself could be observed, adjusted, and, in a limited way, predicted. From this foundation, later Babylonian scholars, like those at the famed Library of Ashurbanipal, would make shockingly accurate astronomical predictions. Lunar eclipses, solstice shifts, the rise and fall of Venus in the morning sky. These weren't guesses. They were carefully tracked cycles, noted over centuries, and often checked against shadow-length records kept beside humble gnomons. And so, in a civilization best known for ziggurats and mythic kings, there also lived a quiet breed of scientists, men and women who cared obsessively about how long a shadow stretched over bricks. But what did it mean to live by the sun's rhythm? A Babylonian merchant might use the temple gnomon to decide when to pack his goods. A school teacher might end lessons when the shadow fell into the ninth groove. A priest might begin a prayer precisely when the shadow aligned with a carved line first etched 2 centuries prior. All this relying on sunlight, stone, and memory. Yet even as these shadow traditions deepened, a question lingered at the edge of every courtyard. What happens when night falls? The shadow, their silent guide, disappears, and with it, the day. But surely the Babylonians didn't just sleep once the sun was gone.
When the shadow vanished and the last stripe of orange light slid behind Babylon's terraced walls, a peculiar quiet settled over the city. The world of gnomons, their grooves, their ratios, their rhythmic observations went dark, and yet people still moved. The temple still functioned. Life in Babylon did not end with daylight. So what then did timekeepers turn to once their most faithful servant, the shadow, ceased to be? They turned to water. The clepsydra, or water clock,
might not have been born in Babylon, but it certainly found one of its earliest and most meticulous homes there. While gnomons required the sky, the clepsydra whispered of time through the slow, inevitable trickle of water, quiet, steady, and unaffected by clouds or night. At its core, the Babylonian clepsydra was a simple vessel, usually ceramic or bronze, with a pinhole near the base and carefully measured markings on the inner wall. As water dripped out, the waterline lowered, passing the etched marks that corresponded to units of time. But of course, nothing in Babylon was left unmeasured. The shape of the vessel, the size of the hole, the quality of the water, all of these mattered, and so timekeepers developed tables just as detailed as those for the gnomon. They logged how long it took for water to move from one mark to the next under different conditions: heat, humidity, even moonlight exposure. Water, after all, could thicken or evaporate. A poorly kept clepsydra might lie just as surely as a cloudy sky. Despite the complexity, the clepsydra had advantages. It worked indoors, it worked in secret, and most importantly, it gave the Babylonians their first taste of truly mechanical time, something that did not rely directly on the sun or stars. This made it invaluable for night rituals, astronomical calculations, and guard duty rotations, especially in temple complexes where precision, even in darkness, was demanded. There were even specialized roles: nighttime keepers, assigned to refill clepsydra, track their flow, and adjust schedules when discrepancies arose. Their job was a lonely one, wandering echoing temple corridors with jugs of cool water, listening to the faint plink of time emptying into the past. You might picture such a figure, a young acolyte with oil-stained robes, crouching beside a bronze vessel, watching moonlight catch the ripples. He doesn't look up often. He knows the stars above are turning, but his concern is liquid, not light. The clepsydra had no grandeur, no architectural presence like the gnomon, but it was intimate. It could be held in two hands. It brought time indoors, into the rooms of scholars and scribes, and eventually into the homes of the elite. Still, water clocks had their quirks. They had to be calibrated against the sun. Each morning the timekeeper would compare the gnomon's shadow to the clepsydra's measurement, adjusting one or the other to bring the systems back into alignment. This daily reconciliation, sun and water, shadow and trickle, formed the spine of Babylonian timekeeping. By the time the Neo-Babylonian Empire emerged in the 7th century BCE, this dual system of gnomon and clepsydra had become refined. The great ziggurat of Etemenanke, the possible inspiration for the Tower of Babel, may have hosted one of the most advanced shadow-based observatories in Mesopotamia. Here priests watched the skies by night and the shadows by day, blending observation with ritual, science with belief. But there was more than just functionality at play. To the Babylonians, time wasn't just something you measured, it was something you participated in. Time was seen as cyclical, but not static. It flowed, it returned, it demanded care. That's why scribes tracked not only when things happened, but how time itself behaved. Was the sun rise earlier this year than last? Was the moon's rise slower in this month of Ululu than the last time it appeared? These patterns mattered because they were believed to mirror the will of the gods. If the shadow fell oddly, if the clepsydra ran too fast, it was not just a mechanical concern, it was a cosmic one. Priests interpreted these anomalies like physicians reading pulses. Time in their hands became both an instrument and an oracle. But still, for all their observations, all their etched tablets, and all their theories, the Babylonians never tried to tame time the way modern people do. There was no drive to divide the day into rigid chunks, no obsession with precision for its own sake. To them, time was something you listened to, a conversation between earth and sky, stone and shadow, water and clay. And in that quiet conversation, the role of the timekeeper was not to speak, but to watch, to record, to wait. Eventually, the methods of Babylonian timekeeping would influence the Greeks, and through them, the Romans. The gnomon became the sundial. The clepsydra evolved into complex gears and escapements. And time, once governed by shadows and water, would be ruled by ticking metal teeth. But something was lost along the way. The whisper of a shadow across a sun-warmed courtyard, the soft drip of time in a dim ziggurat corridor, the silence that marked the moment when the gnomon's tip stood directly under the sun, casting no shadow at all. A sacred pause in the center of the day. What does it mean to measure time not by compulsion, but by cooperation? To treat time not as a master or a threat, but as a companion. That's what the Babylonian timekeepers understood. And maybe in the quiet spaces between ticks and talks, we can still hear their answer.
You are standing in a Roman pistrinum, sometime around 70 CE, just before the sky shifts from ink to ash. The air is thick with a dry, yeasty warmth and the faintest scent of burning olive wood. Stone mills line the walls, donkey-powered grindstones still creaking as the last of yesterday's wheat becomes today's flour. And somewhere near the domed rear of the bakery, a man holds his hand over the oven's mouth, not to check the temperature, but to estimate the moment. He is not using a clock. He cannot read the hour. But he knows, almost instinctively, when the fire is ready. This is the quiet labor of the Roman baker. Time, for the baker, is not an abstract division of seconds. It is dough texture. It is the color of the flame on the wall. It is the way his skin tightens from the heat at a distance of 3 paces. You may think of Rome as a civilization of legions and emperors, but behind every great forum, every feast, and every military march stood a small army of anonymous bakers, many of them enslaved, many others freedmen, who woke before the roosters and slept after the last embers cooled. They did not keep time with sundials. No shadows stretched in these kitchens. Instead, they kept time with their hands. In Rome's booming cities, particularly Pompeii and Ostia, commercial bakeries were as ubiquitous as modern coffee shops. Called pistrina, these workshops ranged from modest homespun operations to sprawling production houses feeding entire neighborhoods. Some even had storefront counters where citizens could purchase their daily bread, panis, much like we do today. Inside, the daily rhythm began in darkness. Before any mixing or kneading could start, the fornax or oven had to be stoked. These massive domed ovens, shaped like squat beehives, were lined with volcanic rock or clay tiles. Heating them wasn't a matter of setting a timer. It was an act of judgment. Too little heat and the crust would be limp. Too much and the outer layer would burn while the center remained damp. Timing was everything. But again, there were no clocks. So how did Roman bakers know how long to heat an oven? They watched. They listened. They smelled. A skilled baker could tell the oven's readiness by observing how quickly a thrown handful of flour browned and curled. Others gauged the glow of the embers or listened to the faint crackling of the fire against stone. One trick involved watching for how long a sliver of dough took to blister when placed near the back wall, like a living thermometer. You might imagine a young apprentice squinting through the oven's mouth, holding his palm near the heat, flinching and whispering, "Tempus est," it is time. Meanwhile, the older baker would already be shaping dough, formed the day before, fermented overnight in large clay bowls under linen cloths. This was panis quadratus, the signature Roman loaf, scored into wedges for easy rationing, often branded with a bakery's mark before baking. Archaeologists in Pompeii have found dozens of these preserved in ash, frozen at the exact moment Mount Vesuvius erupted. But in this peaceful moment, long before disaster, the oven is nearly ready and dough is laid gently onto wooden paddles. Here's where timekeeping gets even more interesting. Roman bakers had no timers, no hourglasses by the oven. Instead, they relied on songs. Yes, songs. Some oral histories and secondary sources suggest that Roman bakers and their apprentices used traditional chants or rhythmic verses, each lasting a predictable duration, to track the baking time of certain loaves. Think of it like singing "Happy Birthday" while washing your hands. Only these were longer, regional, and sometimes adapted for the bakery's tempo. An apprentice might be told, "Sing the Song of 3 Hills 3 times, then check the crust." The older bakers didn't need to sing. They'd simply feel the loaf's doneness through scent, by tapping its base for a hollow sound, or watching for small cracks along its scored lines. Even rising times were marked by sensation. If the air was cool, they let the dough sit longer. If it was a humid morning, they shortened the proof. But always, always, they kept the tempo of the day moving forward. The first round of loaves would be in and out of the oven by sunrise, ready for delivery boys to carry in baskets down the cobbled streets. Wealthier clients had standing orders. Poorer ones waited by the bakery doors with coins warmed in their palms. Still, the real story here isn't the bread. It's how the bakers managed to keep pace, day after day,
without a single clock on the wall. One method involved the movement of light through the bakery itself. Roman homes and shops were built around courtyards. Light filtered through small oculi, roof openings, narrow slits, or open entryways. In some bakeries, timekeepers used the creeping shaft of sunlight across the wall to track the morning's progress. When the beam reached the third tile, it was time to begin mixing a second batch. When it touched the top of the grain jar, deliveries should have left. Was this precise? Not by modern standards, but it worked. Of course, there were also more structured forms of time. Some bakeries operated under military contracts, especially in Rome's garrison towns. These bakers, many of them enslaved by the state or employed under strict oversight, had to deliver bread by the third hour after sunrise, a deadline enforced not by watches, but by patrols. In these cases, you might hear the town crier, called the praeco, announce the passing of time as he walked the streets. "Second hour past sunrise," he'd shout, and bakers would mutter to themselves, rushing to load carts, flour coating their arms like marble dust. But what about baking at night? There are hints, scattered in law codes and satirical texts, that some bakers kept their ovens going long after dusk, especially in summer. With cooler air and less demand, they could prepare dough more comfortably. But without sun, they turned to oil lamps and habit. The timekeeper, usually the master baker, knew when to swap loaves based on the flicker of firelight across the dome. It was a world of repetition, routine, and reliability. A world where time was not told, but lived, felt in the heat, the hunger, and the hum of the city waking around them. Still, you might wonder, in a civilization as advanced as Rome, didn't someone try to improve this? Wasn't there ever an attempt to mechanize bakery time? The answer is yes, eventually.
You find yourself in the heart of Rome now. Not the sleepy quarters of a provincial town, but the clamor of the capital. The streets are narrower here, packed with carts and cloaks and shouting merchants. And just off one of the main vici, a more ambitious pistrinum hums with life. The walls are smoke-darkened, the ovens hotter, the orders larger. A baker here doesn't just feed a neighborhood. He supplies a domus, or even an imperial kitchen. And in one corner of this smoky workshop, someone is attempting something almost radical. He's tying a leather strap to a turning spit beside a metal disc notched with tiny lines. A rudimentary gear clicks once, then again. This is not just baking, it's engineering. By the 1st century CE, Roman minds, some trained in Alexandria or Athens, began to apply mechanical principles to the rhythms of the kitchen. Timekeeping, even here, was creeping toward innovation. Let's take a moment to appreciate what that meant. The ancient Romans did in fact have sundials. These ranged from simple stone slabs placed in public squares to more ornate portable dials made from bronze or marble, often personalized with inscriptions. Wealthy homeowners installed them in gardens. Even some bathhouses and marketplaces had them displayed prominently. But sundials had two key problems. First, They only worked with sunlight. Second, they weren't consistent across regions. A sundial made for Rome would give the wrong time in Alexandria or Gaul unless it was recalibrated. This limitation wasn't fully solved until much later empires. Still, for bakers who worked before the sun rose, sundials were mostly ornamental. That didn't stop a few from experimenting. Some bakery owners began positioning fixed sundials inside their courtyards, not to measure hours precisely, but to serve as calibration markers for other timekeeping tricks. For example, if the sundial showed third hour just as the long bread batch finished baking, the bakers took note. The next day, they might match the sound or color or scent of the loaf to that same shadow line. Over time, a working system of visual and sensory cues was built up, not precise, but highly repeatable. Meanwhile, more inventive minds looked elsewhere. Enter the horologium. This term referred to several types of timekeeping devices, some water-powered, clepsydra, others mechanical. In Alexandria, devices with floating dials and dripping basins were already being used in scholarly settings. But by the early empire, a few had made their way into the hands of artisans. One tale, buried in a marginal Roman commentary, tells of a baker in Ostia who paid a Greek engineer to build him a water-singer clock. It wasn't much, just a jar that slowly filled over a measured hole, activating a small whistle when it overflowed. But it gave him a sense of interval, one long song per kneading, 1.5 for first bake. In wealthier kitchens, engineers even attached primitive gear systems to rotating roasting spits, turning meat with precision over long hours. Some scholars believe that similar logic was eventually applied to baking, timing the duration a batch sat near heat on the basis of a full turn of a spit. But these were luxuries. For most Roman bakers, timekeeping remained organic. They timed their work by the position of the sun in the courtyard, the feel of flour in the air, or the way a dog barked at a neighbor passing by. The soundscape of Rome, vendors calling out fish, the distant rhythm of soldiers marching, acted as a kind of external clock. The city itself was the timekeeper. Still, the empire was changing. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was sprawling. Granaries multiplied. Military bread rations became more standardized. And with the rise of state-sponsored bakeries, especially under Emperor Aurelian, who established government-controlled bread production, the need for uniform timing intensified. These public bakers were known as the corpora pistorum, and they were given flour rations from the annona, the grain dole. Their obligation? Produce bread, consistently, efficiently, on time. Here we find evidence of tighter work protocols. Tablets discovered near Rome's grain ports mention standard oven cycles, rotating shifts, and ration measurements tied to sunrise and mid-morning intervals. Though still without precise clocks, these operations were guided by temporal checkpoints, sunrise, market bell, soldier rotation, tied to the day's rhythm. And those old songs? Still present, passed from master to apprentice, they adapted to new batch sizes. Some songs timed multiple bakers, starting together, pausing between verses to shift positions, flip loaves, or check the firebox. It became not just timekeeping, but orchestration. Imagine a team of 6 bakers, each with flour on their arms and sandals smudged in ash, chanting softly as they work, like a bakery choir. No conductor, just memory and motion, and each note, each word, marking a moment in time. Still, one question lingers. With all this change, all this quiet engineering, what happened to the individual baker's sense of time? When standardization arrived, did something get lost? Did the master baker, once guided by scent and softness, now follow schedules like a soldier? Or did he still sneak his hand near the oven's mouth, just to be sure? The fire still crackles low in the oven. A faint trail of smoke curls up into the early afternoon haze. And outside the pistrinum, carts rattle by, wheels striking cobblestone like metronomes. It is the 6th hour of the Roman day, sexta ora, somewhere around noon, though few bakers ever stopped to ask precisely what time it was. In this final chapter of the Roman baker's quiet empire, we turn our gaze to what came after the fire, the system that bread created, and how, without realizing it, the simple act of baking began to mold not just loaves, but law, labor, and legacy. Let's begin with the Corpora Pistorum, Rome's state-controlled baker guilds. By the late 3rd century CE, the Roman state recognized something surprisingly modern, that bread was infrastructure. An empire was only as stable as the stomachs of its citizens. The annona, Rome's grain supply system, became central to governance. Its smooth function was critical, especially for the city's swelling population of over 1 million. And central to that machine were the bakers. Under Emperor Aurelian, reigned 270 to 275 CE, bakers were no longer just tradesmen. They were civil servants, tied to the state by law. Their responsibility? Take the grain distributed by the praefectus annone, convert it into loaves, and deliver it to Rome's hungry citizens with clockwork regularity. But how do you enforce a delivery system in a world without reliable clocks? With ritual, repetition, and consequences. Deliveries were expected at certain points during the day, marked by solar movement and market activity. Loaves had to arrive before the afternoon bells to ensure freshness. Bakers were held to these standards with strict penalties. Late delivery could result in fines, repeated infractions, imprisonment, or confiscation of property. The bakers became a hereditary caste in some areas. Sons were expected to follow fathers into the ovens. Bakers were forbidden to leave their trade without special permission. Why? Because time, in bread form, had become political. Missing a delivery wasn't just a failure of business, it was a failure of the state. And so timing loaves was no longer an art, it was an obligation. You can picture it, a baker, once proud of his intuition, now forced to bake not when the dough felt ready, but when the cart arrived. He doesn't measure by scent or flame anymore, but by the shadow of a column in the bakery courtyard. When it passes a certain brick, he begins. When it falls behind the water trough, he stops. The rhythm of life became ruled by grain schedules. But even in this systematized world, the essence of baking time, its human heart, persisted. Some bakers developed personal tricks for meeting quotas without losing quality. They planted garden sundials in the back corners of their shops. They trained apprentices to read shadow lengths from doorway slits. Some painted subtle hour marks on the floor, timed to how sunlight crept through the windows as the sun arced westward. And in regions where Roman control softened, Gaul, North Africa, the Levant, local bakers kept their own hybrid rhythms, a blend of Roman routine and native observation. Some used wind direction to anticipate oven draw. Others continued chanting baking songs passed down for generations, especially among freedmen's guilds. In Pompeii, many bakeries were family-run. Wall paintings depict loaves stacked in pyramids, donkeys tied to grindstones, and ovens glowing behind open doors. Time in those homes wasn't military, it was familial. Bread wasn't just sustenance, it was memory. And memory, as always, doesn't follow a clock. But perhaps the most telling detail comes from the archaeological remains of bakeries themselves. In dozens of locations, Pompeii, Herculaneum, Ostia, loaves of panis quadratus have been found, still intact, their crusts blackened by volcanic ash, their scoring still visible. Many bear stamps, names of bakeries, owners, or distribution marks, proof that they were part of Rome's greater food system. And yet, every single loaf is slightly different. Some are a little thicker. Some lean to one side. Some have uneven scoring, the marks of human timing. In a world growing obsessed with standardization, these loaves whisper something different, that timing, even in Rome, was still personal. That no matter how many bureaucrats tried to control the oven, the baker's hand, the feel for the dough, the glow of the coals, still mattered more than any schedule. And it's this tension between mechanical time and embodied time that echoes most quietly through Rome's bread history. Today, you can walk into a modern bakery and see glowing timers, humidity-controlled ovens, and precision thermometers. But you can also still watch a baker slap dough between their palms, tap the bottom of a loaf to check for hollowness, or lean forward and simply smell the readiness of the crust. In that moment, you are watching something that hasn't changed in over 2,000 years. Not the recipe, not the ingredients, but the rhythm, the way time is felt. And so the question lingers, soft and warm like a loaf just out of the oven. Can the passing of time ever be fully measured? Or is it always, in the end, baked into us? And that, dear listener, is where our story slows to a stop. The bridge is quiet again. The pot is off the fire. And history, as always, keeps ticking along in the background, too slowly to notice. If you're still awake, thank you for listening. And if you've already drifted off, well, that was the plan all along. Good night, and good history.